What happens when a Hollywood legend known for his humanitarian work comes face to face with a talk show host who refuses to back down? It only took 21 seconds for a conversation about global activism to explode into one of the most shocking confrontations in daytime television history. Before we get into this absolute chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the drama that happens when egos clash and tempers flare on live television. Last night on The View, Richard Gere sat down with the hosts for what everyone thought would be an inspiring discussion about his decades of activism and humanitarian work. Instead, what unfolded was a battle of wills that left the entire studio in shocked silence and ended with Richard storming off the set in absolute fury. From the moment Richard walked onto that stage, the atmosphere felt charged with an unusual energy. The audience gave him warm applause, genuinely excited to see the iconic actor who has spent so much of his life fighting for human rights causes around the world. He smiled graciously, waved to the crowd, and took his seat at the table with the hosts. But anyone paying close attention could see something brewing beneath the surface, especially in Behar's expression. The conversation started off well enough. The hosts asked Richard about his latest humanitarian projects, his work with various refugee organizations, and his continued advocacy for Tibet and the Dalai Lama. Richard answered thoughtfully, speaking passionately about the causes he cares about, sharing stories from his recent trips abroad, and talking about the urgency of various global crises. The audience listened intently. The other hosts nodded along supportively. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, but Joy had been sitting there quietly, watching Richard with an expression that suggested she had something on her mind. She waited patiently, letting the other hosts ask their questions, biding her time. And then, about 8 minutes into the interview, she saw her opening and took it without hesitation. "So, Richard, I want to talk about something that's been bothering me," Joy said, her tone shifting noticeably from the friendly atmosphere that had been established. "You've spent decades talking about human rights abuses in China, particularly regarding Tibet, but you've been conspicuously silent about human rights issues right here in America. Why is that?" The energy in the studio shifted immediately. Richard's expression changed from open and friendly to guarded and defensive in an instant. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not expecting Joy to go in this direction. "This wasn't on the approved topic list." "I wouldn't say I've been silent," Richard responded carefully, his voice measured. "I've spoken about various issues here in the United States on many occasions, but my primary focus has been on the situation in Tibet, because it's something I've been deeply involved with for most of my adult life." "But don't you think it's a bit hypocritical," Joy pressed forward, leaning in with a challenging expression, "to spend so much energy criticizing another country's government while ignoring the problems in your own backyard? We have plenty of human rights issues right here in America that could use a celebrity voice like yours. Where's Richard Gere for those causes?" Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening noticeably. You could see his shoulders stiffen as he processed the accusation embedded in Joy's question. "I don't think it's hypocritical to care about multiple issues simultaneously. And I haven't ignored problems here in America. I've been involved in various causes over the years, but Joy, there are millions of people suffering under an oppressive regime in Tibet. Their entire culture, their way of life, is being systematically destroyed. The situation there requires sustained international attention. And there aren't people suffering here?" Joy shot back quickly, not giving him a moment to breathe. "We have mass incarceration on a scale that's unprecedented in human history. We have police brutality. We have children in detention centers at the border. We have poverty and homelessness in every major city. But you fly halfway around the world to talk about Tibet, while staying relatively quiet about what's happening right here in your own country. That seems awfully convenient to me." The audience was starting to feel the tension now, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. What had begun as an inspiring conversation about humanitarian work was quickly turning into something much more confrontational and uncomfortable. The other hosts looked increasingly uneasy, exchanging glances that suggested they weren't sure whether to intervene or let this play out. Convenient? Richard's voice took, on a sharp edge, and you could hear the offense in his tone. There's nothing convenient about dedicating your life to a cause that's cost you professionally. I've faced real consequences for my activism. I've been banned from an entire country. I've lost film opportunities because studios don't want to anger the Chinese market. So don't sit there and call my decades of work convenient. I'm not questioning your dedication, Joy clarified, though her tone remained challenging and skeptical. I'm questioning your priorities and what they say about you. Why is Tibet more important to you than the issues facing marginalized communities right here in your own country? Why is the suffering of people thousands of miles away more worthy of your attention than the suffering happening right outside your door? I never said it was more important, Richard countered, his frustration starting to show clearly in his voice and body language. You're creating a false dichotomy here, Joy. You're suggesting that I have to choose between caring about Tibet and caring about domestic issues. That's not how activism works. That's not how compassion works. I can care about multiple things. But I've built real relationships with Tibetan communities over 30 years. I've studied their history and culture extensively. I have a deep personal connection to that cause that drives my work. A personal connection, Joy repeated, with a hint of skepticism, her eyebrows raised. You're a wealthy white man from Philadelphia who decided that an Asian spiritual movement spoke to you on some deep level. Do you not see the privilege in that? Do you not see how that might look to people who are dealing with oppression right here at home? People who don't have the luxury of choosing which causes to care about? Richard's expression hardened considerably, his eyes narrowing. Now you're reducing my entire life's work to some kind of privileged spiritual tourism? That's incredibly insulting, Joy. That's offensive on multiple levels. I've spent over 30 years working with these communities. I've met with political prisoners who've been tortured. I've visited refugee camps. I've seen the suffering firsthand. This isn't some hobby or fascination. This is my life's work. And I'm sure you have, Joy said, not backing down even slightly, her arms crossing defensively. But you have to admit, there's something interesting, something worth examining, about Hollywood celebrities who fly to exotic locations to fight for causes while their own country has massive problems they barely acknowledge publicly. It's easier to be a hero somewhere far away, isn't it? It's easier when you don't have to deal with the complicated politics of home. Easier? Richard's voice rose noticeably, his composure starting to crack. You think what I do is easy? You think it's easy to stand up to the Chinese government, one of the most powerful entities on the planet? To risk your entire career for something you believe in? To be blacklisted and threatened? What exactly have you sacrificed for any cause, Joy? What have you actually put on the line? The tension in the room escalated dramatically with that question. It was a direct attack, and everyone felt it. Joy's eyes widened, and you could see her preparing her response, gathering her thoughts for a counterattack. The other hosts looked like they desperately wanted to jump in, but didn't know how to diffuse a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. I'm not the one sitting here claiming to be a great humanitarian, Joy fired back, her voice sharp and cutting. I'm a talk show host, asking valid questions about selective activism. I'm asking questions that a lot of people are thinking but are afraid to say. And the fact that you're getting so defensive about it, the fact that you're attacking me personally, tells me I've hit a nerve. Truth hurts, doesn't it? You haven't hit a nerve, Richard said through gritted teeth, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. You've made a baseless accusation without any understanding of what my work actually entails. You've suggested that my activism is somehow less valid, less authentic, because I haven't lived up to your personal standard of what activism should look like. That's not fair, and frankly, it's not informed by any real knowledge of what I do. Not informed? Joy's voice rose to match his. I'm plenty informed, Richard. I read the news. I see which causes get celebrity attention and which ones don't. And I notice patterns. Tibet gets Richard Gere. Meanwhile, issues affecting black and brown communities in America struggle to get that same level of star power. That's a completely unfair characterization, Richard shot back immediately. There are plenty of celebrities working on domestic issues, and the fact that I've chosen to focus on a specific cause doesn't mean I don't care about others. This is exactly what's wrong with modern discourse. Unless you're fighting for every single cause simultaneously, you're somehow a hypocrite. One of the other hosts finally tried to intervene, her voice calm and diplomatic. I think what Joy might be trying to say is that there's a conversation to be had about where we direct our attention and energy. Richard, nobody's questioning the validity of your work. It's more about the bigger picture. But Joy wasn't interested in having things smoothed over. She was in this now, fully committed to her line of questioning. No, I am questioning it, actually. I'm directly questioning why someone with Richard's enormous platform and substantial resources has spent decades focused primarily on issues thousands of miles away, while being relatively silent about comparable issues. Right? Here at home. It's a completely valid question, and he should be able to answer it without getting hostile. Relatively silent? Richard was almost shouting now, his voice echoing through the studio. I've participated in protests for civil rights. I've spoken at rallies for various causes. I've donated millions of dollars to numerous organizations here in the United States working on issues like homelessness, AIDS research, and education reform. But apparently, because I didn't hold a press conference every single time I did something, because I didn't make sure every act of charity was photographed and publicized, it doesn't count in your eyes. This is absurd. This is completely absurd. What's absurd is you acting like you're being attacked when someone simply asks you to examine your choices, Joy said firmly, leaning forward with intensity. I ask you a legitimate question about your activism, about your priorities, and you've gotten defensive and hostile instead of engaging with the actual substance of what I'm saying. That speaks volumes, Richard. The substance? Richard laughed bitterly, a harsh sound with no humor in it. The substance is that you're trying to diminish and delegitimize my life's work because it doesn't fit your preconceived narrative. You're suggesting that caring about Tibet, that working for 3 decades to help preserve a threatened culture, is somehow evidence of privilege or ignorance or moral failure. That's not substance. That's a cheap shot dressed up as social commentary. The audience was completely silent now, holding their collective breath, watching this exchange with a mixture of fascination and deep discomfort. This had gone far beyond a typical talk show disagreement. This was getting intensely personal, and everyone could feel the genuine anger and hurt on both sides. It's not a cheap shot to point out that your activism follows a very specific, very recognizable pattern, Joy pressed on relentlessly. Western celebrities embracing Eastern spirituality and causes while maintaining a comfortable distance from the messy, complicated issues in their own communities. That's not an unfair observation, Richard. That's a documented phenomenon that scholars have written about extensively. A documented phenomenon? Richard's voice was shaking with anger now. You're reducing the suffering of millions of people to some kind of sociological trend? You're suggesting that my involvement is just me following a pattern? Joy, I've dedicated my life to this. I've built real relationships. I've made real differences in real people's lives. I'm not saying you haven't, Joy said, though her tone remained skeptical. I'm saying that your choices about where to direct your energy say something. And when celebrities like you focus on distant, exotic causes while giving comparatively little attention to domestic issues, it raises questions. Exotic causes? Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Did you just call the Tibetan people's struggle for survival an exotic cause? Did you really just say that? Joy stood up as well, matching his energy. Don't twist my words, Richard. I'm talking about how Western celebrities perceive and engage with these issues. I'm talking about patterns of activism that are more about personal fulfillment than actual impact. Personal fulfillment? Richard's face was flushed now. His voice raised to a level rarely heard on daytime television. You think I do this for personal fulfillment? You think I've risked my career? Been blacklisted by an entire country? Spent millions of my own dollars for personal fulfillment? I think you do it because it makes you feel good, Joy said bluntly. I think you do it because it fits a certain image you have of yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. But let's be honest about what it is. You don't know anything about me, Richard said, his voice now dangerously quiet. You don't know my motivations. You don't know what drives me. You're sitting here psychoanalyzing me based on your own biases and assumptions, and you're doing it on national television. I know what I see, Joy responded firmly. I see a pattern of behavior that's common among wealthy celebrities. Distance makes causes more palatable. It's easier to fight for people you don't have to live next to, whose problems don't challenge your own comfort. Richard grabbed his microphone and started pulling it off. The other hosts immediately stood up, their voices overlapping as they tried to de-escalate the situation. Wait, Richard, let's talk about this, one of them pleaded. We can have this conversation in a productive way. But Richard wasn't listening. He was focused entirely on Joy, and his expression was one of complete fury, mixed with disappointment. You know what, Joy? I came here today thinking we could have an intelligent conversation about important global issues. Instead, you've spent the last 10 minutes attacking my character and dismissing my life's work. I don't need this. I'm not attacking your character, Joy said, though there was no apology in her voice. I'm challenging your choices. If you can't handle that, if you can't engage with legitimate criticism of how you've directed your activism, then maybe you're not as committed to these causes as you claim. Not as committed? Richard's voice cracked with emotion. I've given decades of my life. I've sacrificed opportunities. I've used every bit of influence I have to try to make a difference. And you have the audacity to question my commitment? What have you done, Joy? What have you actually done, besides sit in this chair and judge people? I use my platform every single day to talk about issues that matter, Joy shot back. I talk about what's happening in this country. I hold people accountable. I don't fly to exotic locations for photo ops with spiritual leaders. Photo ops? Richard was shaking with rage now. Is that what you think my relationship with the Dalai Lama is? Photo ops? You're showing your complete ignorance about what I actually do. You have no idea what you're talking about. The other hosts were practically begging now for both of them to sit down and calm down. The producers were surely screaming in their earpieces about cutting to commercial, but the confrontation was too intense to interrupt. This was television history being made. I know enough, Joy said, crossing her arms defiantly. I know that you've built a career partially on being the Hollywood face of Tibet. I know that it's given you a certain image, a certain moral authority, and I think it's worth questioning whether that's really about helping people or about helping yourself. That's it, Richard said, pulling the last of his microphone equipment off. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to stand here and let you assassinate my character because you have some axe to grind about celebrity activism. This is beneath both of us. But apparently only one of us recognizes that. Where are you going? Joy called after him as he started walking toward the backstage area. You're just going to leave because someone asked you tough questions? Some activist you are. Richard stopped and turned back one final time. His face was red, his eyes blazing with anger. Tough questions? Is that what you call this? Joy, you didn't ask me tough questions. You made accusations. You impugned my motives. You dismissed decades of work. That's not journalism. That's character assassination. Oh, please, Joy scoffed. If asking about your selective activism constitutes character assassination, you have thinner skin than I thought. Maybe that's why you prefer working with people who won't challenge you. You want to know why I focus on Tibet? Richard's voice boomed across the studio. Because I met people there who changed my life. Because I saw suffering that moved me to action. Because I found a cause that needed voices, and I chose to be one of them. I don't owe you, or anyone else, an explanation beyond. You do when you hold yourself up as a moral authority, Joy countered. You do when you accept praise for your humanitarian work. You can't have it both ways, Richard. You can't be a public activist and then get upset when someone questions your choices. I'm not upset about questions, Richard said, his voice strained. I'm upset about the malicious way you framed everything I do. You've turned my life's work into something selfish and superficial. You've done it deliberately, and you've done it cruelly. And I'm not going to stand here and take it anymore. One of the other hosts stepped between them, her hands raised in a placating gesture. Richard, please, let's just take a minute. We can restart this conversation in a better way. We can find common ground here. But Richard was already shaking his head, already moving toward the exit. There's no common ground with someone who's already decided you're the villain. I've learned that lesson today. Joy made up her mind about me before I walked through that door, and nothing I say is going to change it. I didn't make up my mind about anything, Joy called out. I asked you to reflect on your choices, and you couldn't handle it. That's not my fault. That's yours. Reflect on my choices? Richard's laugh was hollow and bitter. I've reflected on my choices every single day for 30 years. I've questioned myself constantly. I've tried to do the most good I possibly could with the platform I have, and you're sitting here suggesting it's not enough, that it's somehow wrong. Well, you know what? I'm done trying to justify myself to you. I'm not asking you to justify yourself, Joy said, though her combative tone suggested otherwise. I'm asking you to acknowledge that your activism might be as much about you as it is about the people you claim to help. Claim to help? Richard's voice broke slightly. I've helped raise millions of dollars. I've brought international attention to forgotten crises. I've worked with organizations on the ground doing real work. But sure, Joy, let's pretend it's all about my ego. Let's pretend I'm just some privileged dilettante playing at activism. Is that what makes you feel better? What makes me feel better is honest conversation, Joy responded. And I don't think you're being honest about the privilege inherent in choosing distant causes over local ones. I don't think you've grappled with what that says about comfort and convenience. You want to talk about privilege? Richard's voice rose again. You sit here in this comfortable studio, getting paid to give your opinions, and you have the nerve to lecture me about privilege? When was the last time you put anything on the line for a cause you believe in? When was the last time you sacrificed anything? This isn't about me, Joy said firmly. This is about you and your choices. No, let's make it about you for a second. Richard shot back. What do you actually do besides talk? What have you built? What communities have you served? Or do you just sit here and tear down people who are actually trying to make a difference? Joy's face flushed with anger. I inform people. I challenge power. I refuse to let celebrities hide behind their charity work when there are legitimate questions to be asked about it. You don't challenge power, Richard said, with disgust in his voice. You challenge guests on your show who can't fight back without looking bad. That's not brave. That's bullying with a microphone. The insult landed hard. You could see it in Joy's face, in the way her expression shifted from combative to genuinely angry. Get out, she said, her voice low and cold. If that's what you think of me, of this show, then get out. I was already leaving, Richard said, turning away one final time. I don't need your permission. Good, Joy called after him. Walk away. That's what people with privilege do when they're confronted with uncomfortable truths. They walk away. Richard paused at the door to the backstage area. Without turning around, he spoke his final words, loud enough for the entire studio to hear. The only uncomfortable truth here is that you care more about winning arguments than actually understanding the work people do. I pity you for that, Joy. I genuinely do. And with that, Richard Gere pushed through the door and disappeared backstage, leaving Joy Behar standing at the table, the other hosts frozen in shock, and an audience that couldn't process what they had just witnessed. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Joy's face as she slowly sat back down, her expression unreadable but clearly shaken. The other hosts looked at each other in complete disbelief. One of them had tears streaming down her face. Another looked pale and ill. They had been part of thousands of interviews, but nothing had ever exploded quite like this. Nothing had ever felt this raw, this personal, this devastating. The production team finally cut to commercial break, but everyone in that studio knew the damage was irreversible. What should have been an inspiring conversation about humanitarian work had devolved into one of the most brutal confrontations in talk show history. Richard Gere, respected actor and activist, had just stormed off The View after an exchange so heated, so personal, that it would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. This was unscripted television at its most intense and uncomfortable. A real moment of genuine conflict that no amount of preparation could have prevented or predicted.